Hiya, welcome back to the Fennel Shed. Today I'm filming on Solstice Day, 21st of December, so happy midwinter, happy Christmas everybody that's catching this during the Christmas period. I am here today to show you how to make the elements within part 4 of our Grianan block of the month. So this month's episode is all about the log cabin. So this is the block that we're working on today. In the quilt there will be 32 of these. These are actually quarter blocks, and there are 8 blocks in which we have 3 each of these guys. And then right out on the border there are 4 locations where we have 2 more. So that brings us up to the grand total of 32 of them. But once you've made one, you know how they're made. These are, I'm so happy with these, they're 6.5 inches square. They're not shy of 6.5 inches. They're not a wee bit more or less at one end or the other. They're 6.5 inches square. The reason that we put these diagonal designed log cabin blocks in is to pick up, this is the section that you've done. Way back in part 1, we had a fairly simple block with a straight diagonal design across, a divider line that echoed what was going to be the middle of the quilt. But also we had this section up here. And the reason that this section was here is because it leads the eye into the log cabin that clicks into place right beside it. So if you can use your imagination and see where this line will then be a beautiful, subtle, soft line, whereas this is a very clearly defined line, and this will frame the whole inner centerpiece of the quilt. And then echoed beyond that, almost like the effect of a double rainbow, is going to be this shadow line of log cabin. So it's quite subtle, but it's very much there, and it's going to create a huge, big diamond-shaped frame all around your quilt center. So today's episode shows you how to make these, how to cut them, how to prepare for them, and how to sew them that they'll turn out beautifully square like the ones you see here. So I'm going to begin with the cutting. I know many of you will have your packs and not have to worry with this quilt about the cutting, but some of you are cutting it out for yourselves, and all of you hopefully at some stage will apply some of these rules and need to cut out quilts for yourselves. So I'm going to show you how it's cut out. So the centers of all the log cabin blocks are made out of half square triangles. So first of all we have to make our half square triangles. So just like the first section of our part 3 block, we are going to make sets of half square triangles, except this time the size is smaller. Our half square triangles will be 2 inches square. In order to produce a half square triangle that is 2 inches square, we need to start with pairs of squares that are 4 3/4 inches squares. So in each one of these pairs, I have my light and dark contrast. That's fabric number 1 and fabric number 6 if you're using the list that is with your quilt instructions. So in order to get the nicest possible effect with that, I don't cut the 2 fabrics separately. I take my 2 fabrics and take the sections that I've got, be it fat quarters, be it yardage, whatever. I take them to the ironing board and I press them together right sides facing and give them a good press so that they have a tendency to want to sit together. Not stick together, but to sit together. And once you have that done, you cut yourself 2 strips of 4 3/4 inches wide. So that's my 2 strips, the light and the dark together, cut across the half width of fabric. The half width or the width of a fat quarter is enough to give you the 4 sets. So once that is cut into the strips already together, then you can subcut your 4 3/4 inch sets of squares, and what you will have is this. And instead of having one square over here and another square over there that you have to introduce together and try to persuade it to match up, it's cut that way. So it's cut with all the sides and corners matching, and that's, you've got a huge advantage to begin with once you've got that. Then you want to mark them, and you want to mark exactly your center lines across, which is the vertical and the horizontal, and then an X, which are the diagonals. Now remember, the cross are cutting lines only. The diagonals, the X, those lines are for sewing. So cross, cut, X, sew. And for the purposes of you being able to see what I'm doing, I'm going to mark this just with an ordinary biro. And so I'm going into the midline of this pair of squares. And my board keeps me right, my ruler keeps me right. I make sure that the ruler lines are all running on parallel to the lines that are on the board, and then I check that I am coming in 2 3/8 of an inch from my outside edge. And say I'm marking with this a biro so that you can see it clearly. You would use chalk or something that will be removable. And then the midline horizontally, and again I check that I'm 2 5/8 in from the edge, and then I mark my 2 diagonals. And you cannot be too careful when you're doing this. It has to be precise. And if you've got it right, all of those lines will intersect right here in the middle. And if those don't all meet up, you've got it wrong somewhere. So go back to the drawing board, literally go back to your cutting board. So just like we did in block 3, you now sew a 1/4 of an inch, and it's a scant 1/4 inch. And you'll read more about the scant 1/4 inch and the reason for it in your set of instructions. But a scant 1/4 inch on 1/4 inch away, 1/4 inch away from the diagonal lines on both sides of both diagonals, but do not sew the cross. Cut the cross, sew the X. And when you've got that stitched and then cut, you will end up with 8 of these small half square triangles. And even with all the care we've taken, they won't be exactly right. So for all of this cutting, you want a nice sharp blade. And now you can see where I've lined that up, where I can see exactly where my 2-inch lines should be. And anything that's outside a 2-inch line, I don't need. These need to be precise. So my 45-degree angle on my ruler, anything outside that 2-inch line gets trimmed away. And then turn the piece around so that the 45-degree line is coming this way to meet the line on the ruler and the line on the board. It is so important to do that process of trimming. The difference between your untrimmed half square triangle and the one that has been trimmed. This one is exactly 2 inches, and no one of the sides is going off at an angle. This one, on the contrary, isn't exactly 2 inches, and sides are very, very slightly off square. And once you add in the multiple layers of your log cabin, that gets exaggerated and exaggerated and exaggerated as you work towards the edge. That's why this part of the process is so important. So you begin with 4 pairs, you mark, sew and cut, which will produce 32 of these, and then take the time to trim them before you move on to the next bit. Once you have all 32 half square triangle centers carefully made and then trimmed, as you can see here, I've laid them up on the board here so that you can see that they're exactly 2 inches square. Once you have your centers all prepared, then you can move on to preparing the logs of the log cabin. I have developed a way to cut these that is efficient, that works well in terms of how the fabric behaves as you sew it, that wastes no fabric, and that makes the sewing process as stress-free as it can possibly be. And with these logs that we're working with, it is particularly frugal in the way that it uses fabric. So in your pattern, you will get a list of the different sizes of pieces that you need to cut. For every piece that is in our log cabin block, we cut 1 full width of fabric. And by a strip that is the full width of the fabric, I mean edge to edge, which is in and around 42, 43 inches. For these pieces, we need 40 inches, so it couldn't be better, it couldn't be more efficient. So from your various fabrics, you cut the strips, the sizes that are listed in your pattern. I already have that done. So here I have the strips of your light fabric. So we begin with 2 inch, 2 3/4, 3 1/2, 4 1/4, 5 inch, and 5 3/4. Those are all the various sizes for the logs that go into the log cabin. When you go to the other side of your log cabin block, we use 3 fabrics. Fabric number 3, which in our case is this lovely grey with gold inset. Fabric number 4, which is the print but with quite a lot of background visible. And fabric number 5, which again has our background but the print on it is slightly denser. So in log cabin, traditionally you go from the lightest close to the centre to the darkest further on out. So while we have a very, very subtle combination here, it will be visually have a real impact when you see it in the quilt, because in the quilt it creates a large diamond frame around the full centerpiece of the quilt. So now I have all the elements that I need of my light fabrics and my dark fabrics. Those then can be subcut. They're all subcut into slices. All the slices are the same size. It depends how comfortable you are cutting your fabrics. If you want to cut your fabrics individually, the best way that I can advise you to do it is to double and then double again each fabric in turn. So you're cutting through 4 layers, but just of the one fabric. If you feel more confident cutting one strip at a time. And then of that, you will need to be sure that you've got 10 usable inches. So if I start here at the 10-inch line, I check that all 4 layers of the fabric go beyond the 20-inch line. And even though this is just one piece of fabric, I will still put something on it at the far end to stop it from moving as I cut. And now I subcut 1 1/4 inches wide. All of the logs are 1 1/4 inches wide. So by layering that 4 layers deep, instead of having to cut 32 times, you're cutting 8 times. And each slice is 1 1/4 inches wide. Now people go, oh dear me, I can't cut through that many layers. But the advantage of this, quite apart from the fact that it saves your blade, it saves your shoulders, it saves the board, but the advantage of that is that instead of having 32 opportunities to get one of those measurements wrong, you're only doing it 8 times. And that's only 8 opportunities to get it wrong. And you're much less likely to make a mistake. The more often you repeat a thing, the more likely your brain is to switch off and say, oh, this is easy. And that's when you make a mistake. When you've got 8 of them, you concentrate. So that's 8 ready to go. So if you go one fabric at a time, this often happens that you have a little tiny thread. So have your scissors on hand. Now I have been using a good sharp blade, but our boards do get some wear and tear. So a good tip, as you lift them off, if you're lifting this one off, hold on to the one next door with your hand until you make sure that it's going to come away clean. Make sure it's coming away clean. That way you won't upset the whole apple cart. So that's all of the pieces for that size done if you choose to do them that way. I, for years now, have been cutting these rather in their stacks. So for this, I'm going to go back to the stack of light colored fabrics, and I can confidently cut through 10 layers at a time. So on here at the deepest point I have 10 layers. Now if you are going to cut multiple layers, you've got to have a good sharp blade. When I'm doing repeated short cuts, always use a short ruler because you've got good control over it. The long ruler tends to slip around on you too much, so your short ruler. Make sure that at the start every layer of your fabric is below the first line that you're going to cut, and then have a weight. I find this small board is a great tool of all kinds, and I use it as a weight, but I also use it to drag across like that, and it eliminates any build-up or wrinkles or lumps that may have occurred. You can also check, literally like the princess and the pea, to make sure that there isn't a pin or a lump or a bump or a wrinkle. Your hands will feel it even through the multiple layers. So this is prepared, it's ironed, it's lined up. Each one of those fabrics is running along a horizontal line. They can't be going off at different angles. They have to be absolutely parallel to each other. But it's worth taking the time, because now I can cut with each cut, I am producing for myself 12 logs. Each one the exact size that I will need. Now you see why I've put a weight on, because the fabrics don't move or creep as I work across from one side to the other. Whereas if that fabric wasn't weighed down, just the pressure of cutting through with the blade would have it moving. And then the lovely thing about that board being my weight, I can just move it along as I need to, and it doesn't get in my way. If that had depth of its own, I wouldn't be able to work above it and across it. So having cut your fabrics in this way, we have cut 16 full sets, and we even had enough left at the end to have a 17th, and all of those are double, so that's 32 blocks plus 2 blocks extra. In case a block goes wrong or a piece goes wrong, we have extras. So I like to have something like this, a flat tray, the lid of a box, somewhere you can stack these until you're ready to use them. Keeping them in their order and tidy and neat. Now from 34 blocks, that's my total waste. Wouldn't even fill an egg cup. These are the rest of my colored fabrics, fabrics 3, 4 and 5. I've already cut the sections individually for fabric number 5. And the first cuts of fabric number 3. So if you choose to go the individual route, do them in sequence. That's the smallest pieces. These are the biggest pieces. And from the ones in between, I'll do them in sequence so that then you can stack them up in order that they will be added into your block. When cutting, as I have done these in a stack, it is really important to remember to always begin with the raw edges at the end and have the selvage, all the selvages at the far end. You can see this here now where not all the fabrics are the same fabric, so you won't have the same width of fabric and you won't have the same depth of selvage. If you had selvages at this end, you couldn't start cutting until you had come in at least as deep as the deepest selvage. Then you would have to stop cutting as deep as the deepest selvage at the other end. In that way you would lose up to an inch and a half at each end, and you don't have that much to spare. So keep all your raw edges level, whether you're cutting singly or in stacks like this. Begin at the raw edge and begin as close to that cut edge as possible. That is the edge which would have been where you've cut your cloth down through the vertical midline of your fabric. This line here, that line gets cut and that becomes your raw edge. The selvage is out here where you see the edge of the fabric or the printed words along the selvage edge. So keep that at the end that you're working towards, but keep your raw edge at the end that you're starting your cutting. Here I have all the pieces cut and ready on my tray. As I say, it could be a large shoebox or something that'll keep these safe if you're not going to work on them fairly soon after cutting them. And over to my sewing surface, I'm going to take 2 centers, 2 sets of my lights, and enough of the other components to make my first 2 blocks. Keep these somewhere safe. Now in your pattern, I have written out in detail, and I'm always going to start on this right side of the light corner. Now excuse the noise of my machine. And I always work on 2 at a time, because when the machine has one at work, I can be at work on the other one. Press to soften the fabric, open it flat, and press again. And the next piece will fit. And light goes to light, and contrast goes to the dark. And it is always safer to sew with the pieced side facing up towards you so that you can see where these seams are going. So first 2 lights are in place. Now I add the first contrast. So on the light side we add lights, and where the dark is we add contrast. And at this stage our block should be 3.5 by 3.5 inches. 3.5 to there, 3.5 to there. Then we go back onto the light. So from here on in, we will always be crossing 2 seams. The one that's being added will always be going on to the side where there are 2 seams, and that will always keep you right. It doesn't apply to the first frame, but once the first frame is in place, every addition goes on to the side where there are 2 seams. On this side there's 1 seam, on this side there's 1 seam, on this side there's no seam. So we don't add anything onto any of those 3 sides. We always go in where there are 2 seams. So the light goes to the light, it goes on to the reverse. And now in my instructions I tell you to go on the scant side of your 1/4 inch, but here I obviously went too far, you can see, and my 3.5 is to here, and this is superfluous, so I'm going to trim that off. And you can take it back to the board, or you can do it very, very carefully with scissors, but only if you have the full 3.5. Don't trim just because you've got a crooked line. And light again. So now we have our light, first frame of light, second frame of light, and we're ready to go on with our fabric number 4, the second contrast. Five inch. Yep. Now we're adding the final frame. So there we have the first pair. We need 32 individual blocks. I like to make them in pairs. So it's nice to sit down with your fabrics all cut out, ready to go. You've seen the sequence in which they're added. The light ones onto the light side, the deep ones always onto the contrast side. In the pattern, I talk about the importance of using that scant 1/4 inch seam. But it must be consistent. You can't say, oh, the last one was skinny, I'll make this one thicker. Or the last one was thick, so I'll make the next one skinny. That doesn't work. You need to find that optimum seam depth and stick to it consistently. People ask, why are my blocks too small? Your blocks are too small if your seam allowances are too generous. People ask, why do my blocks pull in as if they've got a waist? That happens when you stretch the fabric. That's why we cut all our fabrics parallel to selvage. There's no stretch. These are tight as a drum. And your squares end up being square. And that should be 6.5, and it is 6.5. That should be 6.5, and it is 6.5. That's what you want.